Hey everybody, I'm Denise.
And I'm Dave.
And we grabbed the mic from the DevRel team here at the inaugural Global Graph Summit at Data Day Texas in Austin, Texas, as a part of the graph practice here at DataStax to talk with you all about application development with graph data.
From DataStax, this is the Distributed Data Show.
For some context, we have been talking about this so far and focusing a whole series on application development with challenges and best practices. And so we brought Dave here to get this kicked off. And I'm curious to get us started in this discussion for graph data. What are some of the application and developer challenges that you have faced, and what do you see when you're out there working with development teams?
I mean, I think the most common challenges I see with development teams is really a couple. There's two kind of ways. There's really one is about really understanding how graphs work and having issues with the querying patterns that they're using and the data modeling patterns that they're using. And the other one just kind of loops back into that as far as like the team skills that they have, because it's a different set of skills to work with graph data than it is with what they're probably used to in a more relational manner.
Yeah. So we see that a lot, and you mentioned querying. So what specific performance issues do you commonly see a dev team run into when they're working with a query? And maybe before you get into that, what do you mean by a graph query?
When I'm talking about a graph query, I'm talking about essentially what they use to actually retrieve the data back out of the system or put data in. So basically the relational or the graph version of SQL.
Okay.
And usually what I see people have a problem with is they don't completely understand what their query is doing. They're running it in ways that they're not filtering out data appropriately or at the right time. So it ends up taking a very long time to return data, because graph data, when you're running graph queries, they have this called a branching factor, where they tend to go out and walk through different parts of the graph. Mm-hmm. And if you don't control that as you're going through, your performance of your query suffers.
So that's actually very important. And you just mentioned branching factor.
Yeah.
Can you kind of give us a little bit more of a definition of what that means and kind of the computational overhead that comes into play?
Yeah. So branching factor is really all about the number of successors that a node has to work with. So, for example, if you came to a street and there was 3 different ways to go, that's basically a branching factor of 3. And if you do that many different times in a row, all of a sudden, you can quickly and easily get to 56,000 different choices if you're and that is going to cause a tremendous amount of computational overload on your system and basically really slow down the performance of your query and your server as a whole.
Yeah, that definitely can be a big problem. When you were talking about this just a bit ago, though, you also kind of implied a little bit about the performance issues that can come into play when you're translating your data from a relational world into a graph world. Can you talk to us about some of the maybe like the top 3 recommendations that you would have for data modeling in a graph?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most development teams, most application development teams are very fluent in how to work with relational data. Most of them aren't necessarily fluent in how you work with graph data. So there's certain tricks and techniques you want to definitely think about. First one is really what kind of question you want to answer. What kind of questions is your application trying to answer? And that really flows into how you build your data model to optimize those.
Okay.
Then the second's kind of being open to a lot of the techniques around denormalizing your data down from having the ideal graph model where everything is a separate node to like, practically, in order to do this, I want to copy this field multiple times into different nodes so I can not have to walk extra steps each time I'm trying to query. Mm-hmm. And lastly, I'd say it's probably around just really understanding the constraints of the systems you're working on. If you don't want to have too many different, vertex labels and nodes, because if you do in your application, because now if you do that, your queries get much more difficult to actually write and retrieve the data that you're trying to get.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you just mentioned something specifically about data modeling and trying to understand when things are vertices and things can be edges. Do you run into that debate with the dev team where you can just tell that they've been arguing about if it should be a property or if it should be a vertex?
All the time. And the answer is it's not as clear cut. You have to really kind of look at what the use case you're trying to work on. And frequently I actually find it ends up being both, because you have 2 use cases which want to hit the same data in different ways. So you need to denormalize it into both to optimize, to try and make it the optimal query pattern for both.
That's a really good point. How do dev teams react, if you don't mind digging into that, when you tell them to walk them through denormalization?
Dev teams, it really depends. They kind of run everywhere from like, okay, to why would I want to do that? It's a graph. I should be able to kind of do it this way. What I tend to kind of walk back to is even in the relational world, everyone loves third normal form until it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is no different than that. This is basically, in order to fix query performance problems when working in a relational database, it's really common to copy data into multiple different places, multiple different tables. Graph's no different. It's the problems are the same, the technology's a little different.
Yeah, it is. Well, and I think that brings us back to one of the very first things you mentioned that's vital with understanding and guiding developers through their process in building a graph application. And that was that they need to have the right skill set in order to develop an application. And when we're thinking about relational technology, we've got tons of resources. So how would you advise a new dev team wanting to get into graph application building on gaining those skills, and where do they start?
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as gaining those skills, I'm a big proponent of getting hands-on and trying it out.
Okay.
Getting hands-on and trying it out, but try it out on something that's bite-sized. Don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to solve the whole problem. Try to start with a very small piece of the problem, figure out how to make it work, then move on to the next part of the problem. Don't try and solve the big gigantic ball when you can start with a little corner of it. It's not a corner on a ball, but you get the idea. But and as far as like the skills that you need to do this, it really depends. Ones like graph data modeling, graph data model, query performance, query patterns. There's a lot of good resources out there online. DataStax Academy, for example, is a great one has a lot of great content on it. And as I said, a lot of it really comes down to making sure that you think about your problem completely before you actually start working on it.
Okay. So I really like how you've started to put these into two categories, their skills. You've put their skills in a category of data modeling, and you've put their skills in tools, and actually a third, you've mentioned query languages. So let's talk tools. What kind of query languages or what kind of resources would you recommend for people getting used to query languages?
For you getting used to the Gremlin query language, I mean, I think some of the best content is actually, there's a book out there by Kelvin Lawrence, which is the fantastic book. Yes. It's probably the best written guide to Gremlin that I've found. The Tinkerpop documentation, it does a very good job of walking you through each of the steps. And then actually the DataStax Academy video on Gremlin does a good job of showing you real live examples. So it kind of depends on which type of learner you are, whether you're better at learning from a book or whether you're really better at learning from watching. But those are the places I would recommend starting with.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, it's also to then build and break something, because that's also really how you're going to learn.
Oh, absolutely, because you're never going to learn something just by reading a book until you actually or you never know that you know something until you actually go and try and build it. Because you'll learn so many things that you thought you knew but didn't really grasp until you get to them hitting you in the face.
Yeah, and now kind of thinking about this a little bit more, you mentioned specifically about kind of getting into some resources around data modeling, and I hear you're writing a book on that. Do you want to tell us about that book and where our listeners and watchers can go find it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm actually in the process of writing a book called Graph Databases in Action by Many Publications. You can actually go get it right now. It was just released this week in an early access preview.
Dude, congrats.
I know, it's a huge amount of work. But I like to think of it as basically it's the relational developer's guide to building a graph-based backed application. So the whole premise behind the book is to basically take someone with relational database skills, walk them through their process of data modeling, query writing, actually building an application, and then actually performance tuning that application once you've started to build something, which is really it's kind of to model the flow of how you actually go about building an application.
Yeah.
There's lots of really good resources out there online currently about parts and pieces of that, but there's not really anything that kind of ties them all together in one kind of continuous flow.
Okay, that's fantastic. Now, do we want to get into it now? Because we could get into the topic of taking that app that you're building and putting into production. Do you have any quick advice that you would give for the dev team trying to make that happen?
Sure, we might as well get into it now. I think probably the best advice is get your operations and DevOps teams involved early and get them involved often. Don't try and build something, then all of a sudden throw it over the wall to them. because operations of this is different than what they're used to.
Yep.
You know, they're very familiar with a SQL database and things like that. They're not going to be necessarily be familiar with graph databases and the different unique challenges those present. So getting them involved early, getting them involved often will really help them, bring them up to speed as your development team's getting up to speed, because you can't expect them to go from 0 to 100, much like you can't expect your application teams to go from 0 to 100.
Are you sure? I mean, that seems so reasonable when you say it. Yeah, so thank you, Dave, so much for joining us here at DataStax and being on our global graph practice team. And thank you all very much for watching this episode on the Distributed Data Show live from Austin, Texas at Data Day of the inaugural Global Graph Summit.